It all started on a bitterly cold night when snow was swirling in the air. Out of nowhere, my cell phone rang. Picking it up, I was greeted by the wrathful voice of my mother-in-law on the other end. "It's because of you that my daughter's in this state. Her face is unrecognizable. It's atrocious. You need to take responsibility. Why did you abandon my daughter? You're despicable." My name is Amy, and I'm 33 years old. I live with my husband, Zach. Zach has his parents and an older sister. That single phone call from my mother-in-law that night turned my life upside down. "Give me back my lively girl! Why did you do something so horrible? I swear, I'll make you pay for this. I'll never forgive you." My mother-in-law, possibly out of shock, was making no sense. All she did was spew venom at me. "Mother-in-law, please calm down. I have no idea what you're talking about." Even in my confusion, I tried my best to console my mother-in-law, desperately trying to listen to what she had to say. But all my efforts were futile. "You have no right to be calm at a time like this. It's all your fault. And yet, you have the audacity to say such things. Why didn't you help her? Why did you abandon her?" My mother-in-law was just yelling loudly while crying, and there was no conversation at all. Even when I told her to speak slowly, it was like my voice was not reaching her ears, and my mother-in-law's vitriol continued endlessly. My father-in-law, who seemed to have been behind my mother-in-law, took over the phone. "Amy, I hope you understand what you've done. Do you understand the state our daughter is in now? Fortunately, her life is not in danger, but she has severe injuries. Why did you let her suffer like this?" Since my father-in-law was a little calmer, I honestly told him, "Father, I'm sorry. I really don't understand what you two are talking about. What on earth happened?" He looked perplexed that I knew nothing, but somehow I got him to tell me the story. It was content that made me doubt my ears. My sister-in-law, a single mother, was living with her young child about a 20-minute walk from my home. She had a young boyfriend who she had been dating for some time, and he frequently visited. I had heard from Zach that he had a quick temper and had often raised his hand to my sister-in-law. Apparently, his mood was bad last night, and my sister-in-law suffered from more violence than usual. She felt danger to their lives, so she picked up her child in a frenzy and ran out of the house into the falling snow. Without anywhere to go, my sister-in-law thought of her brother, who had lived nearby, and ran desperately, hoping to find refuge at our house. When my sister-in-law rang the doorbell, Zach, who was home at the time, answered. My sister-in-law stood outside the door, holding her child in her only clothes, her face bruised and gasping for breath. Anyone would have known at first glance that something was wrong, but Zach did not show concern for his own sister. Instead, he seemed a bit irritated and said, "If I let people in without permission, Amy will get mad. Sorry, but can you go home? She's scary when she's angry. You understand, right? Please leave," and turned her away from the door. My sister-in-law couldn't believe what her real brother had said, but she was in immediate danger and needed to hide somewhere, so she begged him in tears. "At least lend me money for a hotel." She had left in a panic and didn't have her cell phone or wallet. But Zach said something even more astonishing. "There's no way I have that kind of money. There's money in the house, but there's no way Amy would let me use it without permission. If I did something like that, she'd divorce me. Sorry, but could you try somewhere else? It's cold, so I'm going in. See you." And he closed the door, coldly sending my sister-in-law away. In utter despair, holding her young child, fearing that the two of them would freeze to death, she trudged back through the snow and reluctantly returned home, only to be met with even worse violence from her enraged boyfriend. My sister-in-law was beaten until her face was unrecognizable, and the child was kicked and lost consciousness. She tried to stop him by clinging to her boyfriend, but the violence only escalated, and her screams echoed through the neighborhood, along with the sound of breaking dishes and things being destroyed. A passerby who heard this and realized something was wrong reported it to the police. After that, my sister-in-law and her child, who had been beaten all over and collapsed, were found and immediately taken to the hospital in an ambulance. Now, although they are conscious, they are seriously injured and have been hospitalized with a prognosis of 1 month for full recovery. I got home late last night because of work, and my sister-in-law did not come after I got home. If I had been there, I would have never turned her away. If I had seen my sister-in-law in that state, I think I would have immediately judged it to be dangerous, let her in, and then called the police. I don't understand why it is believed among my in-laws that I was the one who turned her away. And on top of the shock that such a terrible thing happened to my sister-in-law, I couldn't organize the reality that my in-laws were crying and blaming me for this, and I was very confused. Despite my father-in-law's relentless accusations, I knew I had to clear up the misunderstanding. Frantically, I explained. I wasn't home when sister-in-law came by. I worked late last night at the cafe I run. Had I been home, I would have noticed her unusual behavior and let her in. I would never turn her away. Please give me some time to figure out what happened. Although he wasn't convinced, he seemed to cool down and hung up the phone. That day, I was working late at my cafe, developing a new menu. I had informed Zach about the expected time I'd be home, but I ended up working longer. I ended up missing the last subway and had to take a taxi, not arriving home until past midnight. When I got home, I saw Zach, but he didn't mention a thing about his sister. I was confused about why he had done what he had, so I confronted him after he came home from work that night. His response was shocking. I could tell something was wrong when she showed up, but I was just about to enjoy my beer, and it was cold outside, so I wanted to close the door quickly. Plus, I didn't think there was anything I could do about it. I couldn't hide my anger at his selfish excuse. Didn't you feel anything seeing her like that? Why couldn't you at least let her in? She's been through a lot since you turned her away. When I detailed his sister's current condition, he justified himself by saying, "Remember how you used to complain when my parents dropped in without notice? I thought I was being considerate by not letting her in, thinking you wouldn't like it. What did I do wrong?" Turns out, he had assumed that I would be bothered if his sister showed up unannounced and turned her away. I asked him another question. Why didn't you lend her any money? You could have done that much, couldn't you? He responded, I was taken aback when she asked for money. I'm short on cash right before payday. I just lost money playing slots recently, and I hardly had $10 in my wallet. If I gave her our household money, I knew you would get mad, so I refused. I don't see anything wrong with what I said. I was speechless, completely shocked. I had always thought he was a bit self-centered, but he also had many good qualities. I had been giving him the benefit of the doubt, but I realized it was a terrible mistake. He was incapable of making sound decisions because he always put himself first. He had no compassion for others, not even a bit of kindness. And he was foolish enough to prioritize his drinking over his own sister's distress. But it was too late to realize this now. He didn't seem to feel guilty or responsible at all about his sister being rushed to the hospital. From my perspective, she would have ended up like this anyway, no matter where she ran off to. On the bright side, she's safe in the hospital now. We're both safe. All thanks to me, right? He was talking about it as if it was someone else's business. His heartless remarks were making me feel like I was losing my sanity, so I decided not to talk to him any longer. Holding back my anger, I reported to my father-in-law about Zach's irresponsible behavior towards his sister the previous night. Upon hearing my words, Zach's father lost his composure. In a fit of rage, he exclaimed, "There's no way my Zach would do such a thing to his own sister! You're lying! Stop making up stories, Amy! Are you trying to make Zach the worst just to escape your own guilt? If you're going to spew such nonsense, then show me some proof." He refused to listen to me at all, and again blamed me for everything. I endured his accusations while desperately trying to figure out how to prove my innocence. If things remained this way, I would be branded a monster, while Zach, the real culprit who drove his sister away, would live on without any sense of guilt or retribution. This was a situation I could not tolerate. I remembered that my sister-in-law had arrived at our home around 9 p.m. that night. After much thought, I found something that could prove my innocence. My shop was equipped with a security camera. The footage clearly showed me working alone until around 11 p.m. that night. Armed with this footage and another piece of evidence, a taxi receipt that showed the time I got home, I went to my in-laws and proved that I wasn't at home at the time. I was at my shop when your daughter came home. Do you believe me now? It was probably something they didn't want to believe, but faced with clear evidence, they had no choice but to accept it. Zach's father, his hand trembling, muttered, "So, Amy wasn't home then." Despite their shock, Zach's parents hurriedly called him in to uncover the truth about that night. The moment he arrived, they fiercely demanded, "Why did you drive your sister away?" Just as he had done with me, Zach tried to deflect all blame onto me, claiming that he thought I would dislike having his sister in our home. Hearing this, his father said, "We already know that Amy wasn't home at that time, but your sister says she saw a woman in the house. How do you explain that, Zach?" I was speechless. If there was another woman in our home at 9 p.m., there was only one possible explanation. Wait, Zach, what is going on? Who is this woman? I asked him, my voice shaking. Zach's face turned pale as he squirmed under the questioning from both his parents and me, until he finally confessed everything. When I told him I would be late because I was working on a new menu, he saw it as an opportunity to bring his mistress home. He knew I often came home after midnight when I was immersed in my work, so he felt safe in inviting her over. When his sister suddenly showed up, asking to be let in, he panicked and drove her away for fear of his affair being discovered. "You fool! Not only did you betray Amy, but you also left your only sister out in the snow! What were you thinking? Why didn't you lend her any money? Explain yourself!" His father's anger was overwhelming, and Zach confessed the real reason he hadn't given her any money. He actually had plenty of spending money left, but he didn't want to lend it because then he wouldn't be able to buy the bag and shoes he wanted to give his mistress. He didn't want to upset his mistress for the sake of his sister, so he wanted to get rid of her quick, which led to shutting the door on her, Zach admitted. I was furious, but Zach's parents were even more so. "Before being a brother or a husband, you lack basic human decency. It's our responsibility as parents that you grew up to be this kind of person. But we cannot tolerate this and maintain our relationship. From today, we are cutting ties with you. Don't ever show your face to us again." Zach's father disowned him. In a similar vein, I added, "I'm divorcing you. You cheated on me and put your sister's life at risk by leaving her out in the snow. I can't live with someone like you anymore." Zach was shocked at being disowned and confronted with a divorce, all at once, and started begging for forgiveness, crying, I'm sorry! I won't do it again! Please forgive me!" He clung to his father's leg, but his father simply shook him off. "What you did is the absolute worst thing in our eyes." His parents and I never forgave Zach. Apparently, he had been having an affair with the other woman for a year now. The mistress was a coworker at Zach's company, who he'd been secretly bringing to our house when I wasn't around. It was infuriating to learn I'd been betrayed behind my back for so long. Zach even tried to blame his treatment of my sister-in-law on me, which only added to my anger, so I had no second thoughts about divorcing him. I made Zach sign the divorce papers and immediately submitted them. Right after, I headed to a law firm, hired a lawyer, and filed for substantial damages from both Zach and his mistress. I also called Zach's boss, who had been our matchmaker at our wedding, and reported through my tears that we were getting a divorce. I told him everything about Zach's affair and his mistress. Zach's boss, a man who despised anything against human decency, had repeatedly told Zach at our wedding to never betray his wife. As expected, he was furious when he learned about Zach's infidelity. Word reached upper management, and on his boss's advice, Zach was transferred to a branch office in the countryside. His mistress was moved to a different department where she was made to sort documents all day. However, my sister-in-law's revenge against the two was even more ruthless. Still suffering from the after effects of her injuries, she deeply resented Zach's actions that day. To vent her hatred, she did something even more extreme than what I did. By coincidence, she was working at one of Zach's company's clients and knew some of Zach's colleagues. Using her connections, she revealed and spread within the company the cruelty she and her child had suffered that day. The company's employees, who had thought the divorce was due only to the affair, were shocked to learn the truth. Zach's abandonment of his own sister to cover up his affair was a huge shock to everyone in the company. The rumor quickly spread throughout the company, and Zach was universally suspected of being a terrible human being. Once he was ostracized by everyone, his work was impacted, and after a while, he was demoted. He couldn't stand being avoided by everyone and found it hard to continue working at his new post, so he ended up quitting. To pay me the high alimony, he drained his savings and is still paying me by working live-in part-time jobs. Almost all his salary goes towards the payment, and I've heard he can't even afford a coat for winter and shivers in thin t-shirts. As for the mistress, she was stubbornly clinging to her job, amidst the judgmental glances of her coworkers, despite my demand for damages. After consulting my lawyer, I decided to ask her parents for the payment. When her parents learned about it, they were shocked and immediately made their daughter pay the full amount after confirming the facts. I kept receiving calls from her, which I never answered, but she left numerous abusive messages in my voicemail, saying, "Why did you tell my parents? I had to go into debt to make the payments. My life is ruined because of you." As I found it unbearable, I sent these messages to her parents. I received an apology letter later, promising they would never let their daughter trouble me again, and the harassing phone calls stopped. As for my sister-in-law, her abusive boyfriend's actions became a police matter, and she was able to file for damages for her injuries. It had been tough, but she finally managed to break up with him. My in-laws and sister-in-law apologized to me for initially suspecting me and for Zach's infidelity. Of course, both were painful experiences for me, but I could understand their outrage and loss of composure when they saw their daughter taken away in an ambulance after such severe abuse. After all, Zach's affair wasn't their fault. I didn't hold a grudge against them. On the contrary, I wanted them to properly heal the emotional wounds of my sister-in-law and her child, who had such a terrible experience. If I were in their shoes, I'm sure my parents would have reacted the same way. Furthermore, my in-laws and sister-in-law are fundamentally decent people. Now that I've divorced Zach, I'll probably never see them again, as they are now strangers to me. But I sincerely wish them well and hope they take care of themselves. I moved closer to the cafe I run. Since it's within walking distance, I no longer have to worry about the last train, and I can devote my time to coming up with new menu ideas. Though I was thrown around by unexpected events, I probably wouldn't have been happy if I continued to be married. There are things one must never do as a human being. I firmly intend to always keep that in mind and live a life I can be proud of. That's what I strongly believe.
You threw it away? The $1,500 watch my father gave me as a birthday gift? My husband, Sean, was gifted a watch by his father-in-law. It never left his wrist. I nodded and said, "That's right. I threw it in the garbage. I would do it again, too." Sean became even angrier at my response. He yelled, "You're an asshole, you know that? Are you insane?" I guess you could see it that way, but my name is Michaela, Mickey for short, and I am 29 years old. Sean and I were married a year ago, and unfortunately, we live with my in-laws in their house. My father-in-law never misses an opportunity to put me down. "You're not even good at making tea," he loves to tout. Every day is a living hell. I would pray that I would wake up from this horrible dream. My husband and I went to the same high school, and we re-met at our reunion. He confessed that he had always loved me, and we began dating before getting married a year ago. I was so happy. I loved Sean, and I was so excited about our life together. As long as he was by my side, I would always be taken care of, and I thought that I would be a part of a beautiful family. But now I realize that these thoughts were very, very naive. After we got married, I moved in with my husband and my in-laws. I discovered that my father-in-law was a very troubled man. He was very old-fashioned, a misogynistic man, the type of man who would never dream of making his own tea. And according to Sean, he told Sean's mother that it was wrong for a woman to disobey a man. Once, he threw a plate at her for going against him. I was surprised when I heard this. I couldn't believe it, but it was true. In fact, I started to notice that my father-in-law was quite the xenophobe. He was very critical of me, an immigrant from abroad. I was working as an interpreter, speaking both English and Japanese. Maybe it wasn't because I was a foreigner. Perhaps it was because he didn't think very highly of me in the first place. In any case, he blamed me for everything and spoke ill of me. I love being an interpreter. It's a job where I feel my skills are most useful. Although there were assignments where I had to be on the field, most of my work was done at home for interpreting meetings and things like that. It's a job where I feel my skills are very useful. I was very good at my job, and I did not appreciate that my father-in-law would always insult my work. When he would go on, I would think to myself, "What's wrong with you? Hating someone just for speaking English? Just because they're a foreigner?" I don't prefer foreign countries. I hate English. I don't want to hear a word of English, and yet my son marries an English-speaking immigrant and brings her home to me. I often hear him muttering under his breath, "I can't stand foreigners." When I overhear him, I just want to cover my ears. He thinks that because I'm from a foreign country, I won't be good at tea ceremony or cooking a proper meal. But I've lived in Japan and I love Japanese culture. I've even taken care to learn Japanese manners. I looked at my father-in-law and said, "Even though I'm from another place, I've lived in Japan and I love Japan. Your behavior is embarrassing." Embarrassed? Who is embarrassed? I thought, you should be embarrassed for saying those heartless words to me just because I'm from another country. But even though I was annoyed by my father-in-law's words, I kept my mouth shut. I thought that even though he said such horrible things, he was Sean's father and I should just put up with it. At first I thought, just because he hates me now doesn't mean he won't learn to like me over time, even though he can't even look at me without a scowl on his face or even try to get to know me because of his prejudice. His words were so sarcastic and hurtful to me every day. I'm going to teach you to be Japanese the right way. He gives me jobs to do around the house. There was cleaning, like laundry, but I also had to rub his shoulders. It made me very sad to think that my father-in-law manipulated us to move in with them because he secretly wanted to make me miserable. At least, that's what it seemed like. I knew that I would never be able to understand him. Although my mother-in-law apologizes for him, she knows she can't say anything to him. I feel sorry for her, and I hated him for thinking he could control other people and make them suffer. I hated my father-in-law for being like this. There were times when I wanted to tell Sean the truth about his parents, but he was very busy with work and he was traveling a lot. I couldn't talk to him about it because I didn't want to worry him. Hey, it's time to make lunch. Hurry up. Since I work from home, I was often at home all day. My job doesn't just let me take breaks whenever I want. The meetings I interpret can go on forever, and it's hard to take a break at a certain time. I wanted to have a late lunch alone. That was my favorite. But my father-in-law had other ideas. Hurry up. He didn't care that I hadn't finished work yet. My father-in-law kept calling for me to hurry up. I have to work, so I want to eat lunch on my own time, I tried to explain to my father-in-law one time. This English-speaking job is not good for you. Don't you know it's customary to follow your in-laws' wishes? This is common sense. This is why immigrants are so annoying. They don't know such things, he said coldly. My father-in-law's words were so unreasonable, and it tortured me. He wanted me to cook lunch right then and enjoyed making things difficult for me. The most stressful thing for me was that he made it impossible for me to concentrate on my work. After that, my father-in-law's behavior toward me escalated further. He ordered me to clean the room every morning and made unreasonable rules, such as not getting up from my seat for lunch until everyone had finished eating. They would also come into my room and interrupt me when I was working. I don't want to hear English, I was once yelled at in front of my room. It was hard for me. Why do I have to go to this extreme? I had reached the end of my patience with my father-in-law's words and actions when they interfered with my work. If I didn't do something about it, I would lose my important job. And my heart was in shreds from the daily swipes he would take at my mother-in-law. I can't do this anymore. I was so happy to be married to Sean, whom I love. I thought that if I could stay by Sean's side, I would be fine even if things got bad. But, like I said, I was naive. I can't be with my father-in-law like this anymore. I am not happy at all. Tears welled up in my eyes because it was so painful. That night, I decided to talk to Sean about it, and I began crying. When I told him everything that my father-in-law had done to me, he was absolutely mortified. He apologized to me several times. I'm so sorry I didn't realize. I swore I would make you happy, Mickey. Sean confronted my in-laws about my suffering, and they were angry with me. Then, he made me a proposal. Mickey, let's move out. We don't have to live with my parents. Let's buy an apartment and live together. Are you sure? Of course. I think it is the best thing for the two of us from now on. I was really happy. I felt like I had seen the light in the darkness. I felt reassured, and I was happy to have married this man. So, Sean and I moved out of the house. After we moved out, I never saw my in-laws again, and since Sean gave my father-in-law a hard time for how he treated me, he didn't do anything to me anymore. Life had returned to normal. I was soaking in the happiness of being able to spend my time freely and concentrate on my work every day. I realized that I had taken for granted the happiest thing in my life. 1 year later, I became pregnant. Sean was happy. He was full of happiness. Mom and Dad seem happy too. Sean seemed to have told my in-laws about my pregnancy. Well, that's great. Even though I smiled outwardly that my in-laws were happy, my heart sank. It had been a year since that hellish day, and yet I still felt so bad when I remembered what my father-in-law had done to me. Just because we're having a baby doesn't mean you have to see my parents. I don't want to do anything that will make you feel bad. The most important thing is the baby and you, Mickey, Sean told me. And then I safely made it to the day of the birth, and a healthy baby girl was born. I cried as she squeezed my hand with her tiny hands, and she loved me so much. It was as if all of the pain I had been going through was nothing. You know, Sean asked me with an expression that made it difficult for me to say anything. Can I let my parents see her alone? They were so happy when I told them she was born safe and sound, and I wanted them to see their little girl. Sean then continued. I'm sorry. I told you you didn't have to see them. I shook my head at Sean's words. It's totally fine. I understand how you feel. It's natural to want to let your beautiful daughter meet your parents. And even though my father-in-law did such a terrible thing to me, I know that he cared for you. I wanted to fulfill your wish because I know how important they are to you. It's been a year since then. I'm sure your father-in-law has reflected on what's happened, and I wish I could see him too. When I said this, Sean put on a big smile. Yes, that was a year ago, and people change. Let's think positive, I told myself. On the day I left the hospital, Sean, my daughter, and I were on our way to my in-laws' house. I had not seen my father-in-law since then, so I was a little nervous. When we arrived at my in-laws' house, they greeted us with smiles. Seeing my father-in-law looking a little happy as he looked at his little daughter, I felt relieved and at the same time glad that I had brought her with me. Sean also looked happy, and my father-in-law didn't seem to be making any sarcastic comments to me, which was a huge relief. Thank God, I knew my father-in-law was sorry for what he had done. Then, my father-in-law brought out a gift-wrapped box and held it in front of me, saying, Here is a gift for the birth of your child. It's a $1,500 watch. Please put it on display. $1,500? I was surprised that my father-in-law had prepared such a gift for us, but I was even more surprised by how much it cost. I had never heard of a watch costing $1,500. My mother-in-law, who was standing next to me, was also surprised, her eyes widening. Don't be surprised. It's my way of thanking you for letting me see my grandchild. Father-in-law, I was very surprised, but I was genuinely happy that my father-in-law had given me a gift. Maybe my father-in-law and I were finally starting to understand each other. My heart was filled with joy at the thought of my father-in-law's approval. After returning home, Sean and I immediately opened the gift celebrating our new baby from my father-in-law. Huh? We were surprised to see the watch. We were so surprised to see the watch because it looked like an ordinary wristwatch. We were a little surprised because we had imagined that a $1,500 watch would look much more flashy. We wondered why this watch cost this much, but since it was a baby gift from my father-in-law, we thought nothing more of it and decided to put it on the shelf in the living room. The phone rang. It's from my father-in-law again. Ever since we received that watch, he's been calling us a lot. For a little while, they were about things like wanting to hear about his grandchildren, but then, just like a year ago, he began to speak disparaging and accusing words about me. Even when I got fed up and ignored his calls, he would call again and again. I thought he might be getting suspicious of me. It was exactly at this time a year ago that I was disappointed that he had not changed, and saddened to think that he did not really like me. My father-in-law is such a relentless caller. Sometimes he would barge into my house if I did not answer the phone, so I had no choice but to pick up. The phone rang several times every day, and when I answered the phone, he would say all kinds of hurtful things. I was exhausted from childcare and work and even my father-in-law, and I was exhausted both physically and mentally. I was in pain, I was in agony, and I even cried. How can I get away from my father-in-law now? I thought I escaped him by moving out of the house, but now that I've left, he still torments me like this. Eventually, my father-in-law started pointing things out to me. Do immigrants only clean once a week? You only had Japanese food for 2 days this week. This is why foreigners are no good. These were the points he made about my behavior. Strangely enough, he was also right. How did he know that? I asked Sean if he was telling him, but he said he didn't know. I was a little scared at the time, but I thought it must be a coincidence. But then he continued to point out my behavior several times, and I felt that it was indeed strange, because everything my father-in-law said was true, and the points he was making were getting more and more specific day by day. I was scared. I felt like I was going crazy. You would have to be there to see this kind of thing. I felt goosebumps all over my body at that moment. Yes, you would have to see it to believe it. I tried to recall what had just happened with my father-in-law. No way, I realized. I was in an uproar when I realized what had happened, and I couldn't stop my body from shaking with fear. I couldn't stop shaking with fear because it was something I couldn't even imagine. Then I looked at my child who was sleeping slowly and thought, I had to protect her. I made a decision to do something, even though I felt my body trembling. Mickey? That night, Sean came home from work with the watch in his hand. He looked angry. You threw it away? The $1,500 watch my father gave me as our daughter's birthday present? Yes, the watch in Sean's hand had been given to us by his father-in-law at the birth of our daughter. I nodded and said, That's right. I threw it in the garbage, and I would do it again, too. Sean became even angrier at my response. You're an asshole, you know that? Are you insane? I guess you could see it that way, but I'm not the problem here. Let me show you. Why don't you push this button? I pointed to the black dot on the clock in Sean's hand. The clock that my father-in-law had given me had a little black button on it. Sean angrily did as I said. His complexion changed. What is this? Was the button a reset button? I wondered. We had never looked at it closely before. It's not a button? No, it's not a button. Take a closer look. Sean observed the small black spot just as I had said, and the look on his face became more and more blue. Camera. Sean was absolutely lost in thought. Yes, there was a hidden camera attached to the watch. He had to look closely to see it, so he hadn't noticed it until now. He had been watching us with that camera for a long time. Oh no! The reason my father-in-law knew my every move in detail and even knew exactly what was on the menu for dinner was because he had been watching me the whole time. I was horrified with him for doing this. I had a professional take a look. I even had it debugged. It was all your father-in-law's work. For a while, Sean froze in shock at my words, but soon his eyes became determined to do something. Mickey, I'm really, really sorry. I'm sorry I put you through this again. I'll never forgive you, Dad. The next day, Sean and I left our daughter with my parents and headed for my in-laws' house. As soon as we arrived, Sean went to my father-in-law, put the clock in front of him, and said, Dad, why do you think we're here? You do know why, don't you? Sean's eyes were filled with anger. My father-in-law's face scrunched up a little at the sight of Sean's temper. What are you talking about? He said in a blank voice. What are you talking about? You're crazy to give her a wristwatch with a hidden camera and a wiretap on it. But my father-in-law insisted. I don't know. Oh yeah? So that's why it cost $1,500, but I had no idea. My father-in-law would never admit it. I could feel my anger rising at my father-in-law's refusal to admit it. Do you have any proof? Any evidence that I did it? My father-in-law grins at me. I'm sorry you have no proof, but I'm going to have to ask you to pay the price for my breaking heart. You're the one who's going to pay that fee. My mother-in-law, who had never said anything to me before, interjected. Because I am divorcing you. What? What are you talking about? He was a little upset, but he didn't seem to take it seriously. That's just as well, because until now, my mother-in-law had never disobeyed my father-in-law in any way. I told my mother in advance what my father had done, Sean said. After Sean told me, I had a look at your room. What? My father-in-law, who had looked relaxed a moment ago, was becoming impatient. I wanted to think it was a lie, too. Eavesdropping and photographing is a crime, you know. But in your room, there were videos of Sean and his family and his house and so on. I can't believe you really did this. My father-in-law was seeing red. Sean questioned him further. I asked my mother to find receipts for that watch. Here. Sean put the receipts and order forms for the watches in front of his father-in-law. This watch is custom made. You ordered a hidden camera and a wiretap, didn't you? I have solid proof right here. Then Knowing he could no longer get away with it, he confessed everything. I lost the chance to tell Mickey how disgusted I was with her, so I thought I'd watch her behavior on camera, my father-in-law said. Everyone in the room who heard these words felt a surge of indescribable anger and exclaimed in exasperation. After that, my mother-in-law divorced my father-in-law. My father-in-law had to pay alimony to my mother-in-law. Moreover, the house belonged to my mother-in-law's parents, who had given it to her as a gift. So, as a result, my father-in-law was also evicted from the house and now lives alone in a small apartment. My mother-in-law has apparently been enduring unreasonable orders from my father-in-law up until now. She says this was all for Sean's sake. But before she knew it, she was tied down by her husband and she could not escape. But when she saw me being tormented by him too, she became angry at herself for not having the courage to protect me. And finally, she woke up and said he had to get away from this person. Now that she is free from her husband, my mother-in-law lives at her own pace and very leisurely. Sean also cut ties with his father-in-law, and there was no one left. I live very happily with my husband, Sean, and our daughter. Sean, who used to work a lot of business trips and overtime, changed his job to spend more time with his family, and I can spend more time with him than ever before. And since the incident with my father-in-law, we have been able to talk to each other about any problems, big or small. And I think our relationship as a couple has grown even deeper. I am happier now than I ever have been. Happiness comes in different forms for different people, but I want to cherish my own happiness. It is wrong to sacrifice oneself for the sake of someone else's happiness.